Thank you for having us today. So we're going to get started. So this is from Woodstock to TikTok, sex, drugs, and content moderation, exactly what it sounds like. I'm Jillian. I'm Generation Oregon Trail or eldest millennial. Mathana, also millennial. So we want to just say that this talk is not, we're talking about culture, we're talking about philosophy, we're not talking about regulation today. So a lot of this is just our thoughts on how we got here and what we do next.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here with you. I think that with the theme of this year's Republica, it's a nice time to take stock of where we are, and not just where we are, but what are some of the places that we want to go. We know that social media has revolutionized the way that people connect, but also the way that people become educated, the way that people see themselves and their place in the world. So one of the things that I think is quite fascinating when we're thinking about kind of the generational epochs, and the way that each generation has kind of enculturated the next generation to learn where their place in the world, but also be able to have the freedom and flexibility to discover new things about themselves. And if we think about the early days of Silicon Valley, there was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. A lot of the people that were designing even the circuit breakers were also doing LSD, for instance. And so if you start thinking about kind of the ways that even this kind of new information technology framework came around, this microtization, working from large mainframes to microprocessors. There was at the core of it not just there was new attitudes towards promiscuity and opening up of queerness and these other sort of things that was really a change in the way that civilization of this, the binary and the ways of being able to just pass down that you are in this box. And so for people able to see themselves in new light, they were, it was an exciting time. And so I think that we can ask ourselves this question, or think about it in this way, that some of the people that were designing the framework or the technology that powers social media were coming from a different cultural context than even the people that created social media. And so one of the things we'll be talking about today is the way that there's kind of this generational pushback and this ebb and flow between generations. So right now we're also at this very interesting inflection point. I'm originally from Texas, and right now before the Texas legislature, there is a bill that would ban social media for people under 18 years of age. And we're seeing this around with age verification, other things. So right now we're kind of at this new framework of, are young people going to be able to have access to information on social media in order to be able to learn things about themselves more than just what they're taught in schools and what's passed down to them by their parents.
So with that in mind, I'm going to go back for a personal story to talk a little bit about that generation that we're talking about, kind of mostly the boomers. So my mom, early boomer, and my mom was at Woodstock, and that's why we brought Woodstock into this. She was 17 years old. She went by herself. She had a great time. I've got recordings of her telling me about it. I didn't want to bring them in and expose her like that. But one of the things that I was raised with, born in the early 80s, my mom born in the 50s, she shared a lot of that information with me growing up. I wasn't blocked off from hearing that. I wasn't hindered from hearing about those experiences. And as such, I was told to, stay safe, explore, but I had that sort of experience, that sort of childhood without guardrails. And the same goes for my experience with the early internet. I think those of you, I'm looking around and I'm seeing a lot of people of my generation or maybe even a little bit older, and I imagine that most of you also had that early experience of the internet without guardrails. Now, it wasn't entirely safe, and there are a lot of things that I saw that I hope that the younger folks never have to see or experience, but there were also a lot of things that I got to explore on that early internet that I'm concerned, as somebody who studies free expression and the internet and content moderation, that younger generations are being overly protected from under the guise of protecting children and with regulations such as age verification, which we're seeing crop up everywhere from the United States to the EU to Australia. So how did we get here? I think for me, what I saw in a cultural shift, sorry for this graphic, it's hard to find, but parental advisory explicit lyrics. Does everyone know the history of this one? This is very American, but I'm sure you saw it elsewhere. This came from around 1985. Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife, a number of other women in Washington, D.C., concerned about the music that youth were being exposed to, tried to restrict that music through the parental, acronyms kill me, as you probably know if you've ever seen one of my talks, the Parents Music Resource Center. A committee formed in 1985, and the group's formation basically resulted in the list of compiling a list of 15 songs known as the Dirty 15 that were popular in music at the time. Now, these songs, if you listen to them today, are probably a lot less offensive or wild than some of the things we hear on the radio, albeit with some censorship involved. But nevertheless, for me, this was a cultural experience that I grew up with. I know 85, I was still young, but this really influenced what I could buy, what I could see in the early 90s as well, and straight on into the 2000s. They disbanded around 2000, I believe. But nevertheless, this authority telling me what I could and couldn't see. You know what? I didn't like it, but my parents didn't like it either. And they actually said, you know what? Just buy the music anyway. We'll buy it for you. And talked to me about the things that I was hearing, seeing, etc. And the same goes for film and other things prior to where we got to with internet censorship. But I think by the 90s, and as we're talking about Woodstock, this is from Woodstock 99, one of the two documentaries, Trainwreck Woodstock 99. Has anyone seen this? Okay, so some of you know what I'm talking about. Woodstock 99 was an absolute disaster. I almost went. My parents said I could go, but at the last minute I decided to go somewhere else instead. Different festival, much smaller, much calmer. Woodstock 99 was an absolute disaster. By the time that it got to that point, 30 years after the original Woodstock, it had become basically a capitalist hellscape. There was profit gouging on bottles of water. On the first day, I think they were $3. By the last day, they were $10, something like that. And, everything was just poorly done. By the end, there were fires, sexual assaults. It was an awful experience for many of the people who were involved. Definitely watch one of the documentaries if you haven't seen them. Why do I bring this up? Because for me, this represented a large cultural shift. We had this original Woodstock, this idyllic experience for many people, my mother included, although, of course, in retrospect, there were also problems with that too. People also died at that Woodstock, something we forget. But nevertheless, by the time we got to 1999, we were talking about an entirely different generation. And some of us may have idealized our parents' generation, but there was a mix of people, mostly Gen X and Millennials who attended, some older people as well. But the experience was entirely different. The culture had shifted, and you had an older generation imposing what had become their cultural values on a younger generation in a way that just didn't work, and we saw this explosion kind of happen. And that, to me, was kind of my experience of the 90s, and then I'm going to bring it back to the internet in a second. Do you want to throw anything in with this? All right. So this is where we're at, right? End of the 90s, the internet is exploding. This is a little bit before social media, but by 1999, I was using Napster. I was downloading things illegally. My generation was doing all sorts of stuff. And then comes social media, and then comes backlash. And this is where I get into my core bread and butter, internet censorship. So we see all of this stuff happening on the internet, and governments want to come in and do something about it. And this is long before we have the kinds of restrictions and regulation that we have now. I pulled up an old screenshot from an old slide. This is an example from Kuwait, but there are many different examples of this from all over the world, of governments saying, wait a minute, what's going on here? And by 2000, we already have different governments attempting to restrict what we can see and do on the internet. Again, kind of pre-social media for the most part. But as social media happens, as we get to that point, we see a different set of realities emerge. So by 2011, and that was actually the year that I first attended Republica, I believe, my first talk was there, and it was about policing content in the quasi-public sphere. I think that was the title. It was about social media and how companies had stepped in to take over the role that governments either were doing badly or weren't doing at all. And so we saw this new thing happen, this new phenomenon of companies controlling the spaces in which we could speak, which we could find things, express ourselves, connect with other people, and deciding the rules for us.
And I think one interesting point here is not only deciding the rules for us, but putting the parameters on how we could engage with each other. If we think back, if you all remember kind of the self-hosted, or the platforms like GeoCities, and these small like sort of things, even MySpace, where you as a content creator had this kind of flexibility. Now we're early social media, particularly with Facebook, I think even the parameters of where and how we could express ourselves. We had our feeds, we had our photos, and we only had a limited number of options. And I think there was a kind of this loss of creativity and flexibility about how we could also offer this idea of self-expression. And I think that's one of the things that we see now as in 2025 is that the social media platforms say that we are able to have this self-expression, that we can connect with others, but at the same time, there are very real parameters on how we can do this, and it's really on their terms. And in a bit, we'll talk about even the idea of algorithmic, not even content moderation, but algorithmic feeds, and the way. And so, what is it that young people are seeing? What are the dynamics and the mechanics behind the things that end up in young people's feeds? And this is all very, very different from the early days of the internet, where people had to go and seek out content. And so, really, there's this large question of what is driving the mechanics behind what is reaching us is really pivotal to where we are now.
So I got interested in this back in 2011 because as I was using social media and researching social media and seeing what was happening online, I started to notice that the things that I was able to explore as a younger person were suddenly sort of disappearing. Whether we're talking about political speech, which we're not going to get into today because I've given that talk many, many times, or sexual content or information about drugs. Does anyone remember things like Arrowhead, for example? Okay, we got a couple. Arrowhead was a site that came up in the early days to explain things about how different drugs worked and things like harm reduction. That was a site that allowed many people, younger folks, to be able to explore information without having to talk to their parents or an expert about it, to get people's experiences to sort of understand what they might be getting themselves into, because we know that young people are going to do things that we might not want them to do. Same goes for sexual information. Again, the internet without guardrails, there was a lot of bad stuff out there, for sure. But I was able to access a lot of information online that today's youth, when going on social media platforms, are restricted from doing so. And so why did that happen? I've written a whole book about it. It's over there for sale. It's called Silicon Values. There's a couple chapters that talk about sex. But from my perspective, what we saw is the takeover of these platforms by another generation. And I'm not blaming generations here, but it is my generation that kind of created a lot of these platforms, my generation, one slightly older than mine, and decided slowly but surely to impose rules. Now, some of this, of course, came from requests from governments, some of it came from pressure, some of it came from a shifting culture. But at the same time, a lot of the rules that were created by these platforms and then shaped and shifted over the years have resulted in vulnerable and marginalized voices being censored from them. And we see this, I've got many, many examples that I could talk about, but this is a fairly short talk. But we see this in terms of how it impacts LGBTQ people, how it impacts sex workers. This is a recent paper from the European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance looking at how sex workers are censored on social media, even on their own time, even when they're not doing things that involve their work, even when they're just being themselves. We also see this when it comes to things like breastfeeding moms. We see this when it comes to various indigenous cultures. We see it all over the place. And we see it when we're talking about exploring sexual health information, which is something that particularly concerns me. So we've got a project right now called that we're working with, from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We're working with a group called Repro Uncensored. We're collecting stories about abortion-related censorship, sexual health-related censorship. What we're seeing is that platforms have basically decided that people can't access this information post the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the US. So despite these platforms being truly global, the rules that are the laws that are created in the US, sometimes which are not even requiring the platforms to do something, result in the shifting of policies, the shifting of values within a company to respond to what is perceived as a need, an urgent need. And at the same time, this inhibits people from being able to access information about their own bodies and sexual health in ways that are truly troubling. What we're finding so far, we haven't put out a report yet, so I can only talk a little bit about the findings, but what we're finding is not just the rules being enforced, but the rules being over-enforced. So for example, Meta has a rule that people can't access, or people can't post information about where to buy Plan C or mifepristone, abortion pill, so to speak. Fair enough, you can't link to a site where it's for sale, but at the same time, we're also seeing grassroots information, which is allegedly allowed, about these pills, about these procedures, being censored wholesale by Meta, as well as sometimes by other platforms. And so we'll have a report out soon about that. But that's something that really troubles me and worries me for this next generation's ability to access the internet. Now, of course, there's still the free and open web out there, but how many young people are going beyond centralized platforms?
And I think this access to information is so critical right now because we are seeing around the world a swing back to far right and more conservative ideologies. And so how do young people, when society, when parents, when the state is not going to give people access about information about their bodies, about reproductive care, and even things, I'm not sure of all the cases you might know ever, but even things around kind of the censorship of menstruation. And so how do young people form their attitudes around these things? Did you want to...
Go ahead. No, the slides got reversed.
Okay, right.
Go ahead.
So why don't you talk about this? Okay. So a project that I'm involved in is through the organization Open Archive, create an app called Save. And so thinking about, what are some of the solutions in order to push back against the hegemonic capacity for the sharing of information and critical information that social media companies have on society. And so with Save is just one of these projects. It allows individuals to be able to log into their own hosted server or to the Internet Archive and be able to transmit phone captured media directly to a server. And more and more, seeing the need for long-term preservation and security. This applies everything from evidentiary media for war crimes documentation, but it also can be around sensitive information that people might want to not put on social media, and being able to have ways to be able to kind of circumvent censorship, but also circumvent social controls. I think it's going to be increasingly important, and be able to give young people an option inside of the technologies they already have inside of their phone, to be able to have alternatives that are not controlled exclusively by the social media companies and their content moderation policies.
So with that said, because we want to leave some time for questions, we want to ask, what is the digital future that we want? I mean, we've seen the internet shift. I think most of us in this, I think most of us are old enough that we've seen the internet go from this place, this unsafe internet without any guardrails, which for some of us might have been fun, for some of us might have been not so fun, to a place where most people are tied to certain apps, tied to certain centralized platforms. But we do have so many alternatives out there, and I think that we're seeing that shift start to happen. We went from this hegemony a few years ago, Mark Zuckerberg and Twitter, which is now Elon Musk, which I think most of us are kind of getting off of at this point, to having a million social media platforms bloom. And in many ways, this has been great. In other ways, it's kind of taken us apart from each other and decentralized us. But at the same time, we have more opportunities than ever to control what we see and how we interact. And yet at the same time, I'm also in my professional life seeing a lot of these newer platforms also struggle with how to deal with content moderation, how to deal with some of the worst content, but also how to grapple with political content, with sexual content, etc. And I think that we are going to see this becoming more and more of a problem over the next couple of years as more pressure comes down on decentralized platforms as well. So
some final words before we open for questions. I think that we can now take this moment to think about a more progressive and more structured idea of what we want these technologies to have for not only us, but for the next generation. And so I think if we focus community and care, if we think about education and enlightenment, if we also have some pushback against the drivers and the motives that are pushing out what we might call, counterproductive or unconstructive attitudes. We see a lot of influencers that are being able to have. So I think influencers are one of the things that we probably should talk about more. I just read a report that in the US, at least 57% of young people say that they want to be a social media influencer. And this is a really big number. This almost means that one of the largest career aspirations for young people is to be a social media influencer. And so I think the psychology behind this, what does it mean in order for somebody to get to the position of social media influencer? What are they willing to do? What are they willing to say? And so being able to have more digital literacy for individuals and also between parents and their kids to be able to understand what information that the young people are bringing in is going to be critical, because sex and drugs can provide flavors to life. But it's increasingly important that we tool young people with ways to be able to reduce harm, to be able to make responsible decisions, to be able to not make harmful decisions that are going to be with them for life because they were just young and wanted to explore. And I think that at its core, social media is just such a powerful way for communication technology. Is going to play a pivotal role with this. But by just outsourcing, to content moderation teams, what are the ways that we can communicate is not always going to provide the best set of circumstances for us to be able to, grow up with healthy attitudes. And so I think that more and more we can think about what are the systems that we want, and saying that that economies of influence should be ethically grounded. And just say finally, this is a quote from Sappho, who was writing over 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, and she was talking about the exploration of self, and as what we now would consider a queer woman that was coming to age with these feelings that really society had not kind of tooled her for. And she wrote eloquently and beautifully. And now we look back over 2,500 years later, and see her and hold her up as this sort of inspiration about exploration of being young. And so I think this quote holds true, that what can be said will be wept. And I think this holds true on social media as much now as it did in ancient Greece over 2,500 years ago.
And my final take on this is that I think young people will always find things on the internet that are terrible, but if we censor too much on the centralized places where they can explore information safely, then we're just going to push them into those darker spaces of the internet. That was my experience as a younger person, and in that middle era as well. And so it's important to me that we make sure that people have safe ways to explore information online. So we're going to close out here, leave a little bit of time for questions. Thank you so much. I'm Jillian. This is Mathana. We're grateful for you to be here.